The morning sun barely peeked through the dirty window of the tiny apartment as Jake stared at the bright yellow paper stuck to his door. His heart sank as he read the words that would change everything. Final eviction notice. He had exactly 7 days to come up with $1,200 or he would be homeless. Jake slumped against the door and slid down to the floor. At 22 years old, he never imagined his life would fall apart like this. Just 3 years ago, he was the pride of his small hometown, the first person in his family to get into college. Everyone believed he would make it big as an engineer. Now, sitting on the cold hallway floor outside his cramped studio, he wondered if those dreams were just foolish wishes. The apartment was barely bigger than a closet. His bed was a mattress on the floor, and his desk was a piece of plywood balanced on 2 milk crates. But it was home, and soon even this tiny space would be gone. Jake walked to his refrigerator and opened it, hoping to find something to eat. Inside, he found a half-empty jar of peanut butter, 3 slices of stale bread, and a carton of milk that was probably going bad. He grabbed his phone and opened his banking app, though he already knew what he would see. The screen showed $47.36. That was all the money he had in the world. His part-time job at the campus bookstore paid $8 an hour, and he only worked 15 hours a week. After buying food and bus fare, there was nothing left for rent. Jake had tried everything he could think of. He applied for more financial aid, but the office told him he had already received the maximum amount. He looked for a second job, but most places wanted someone who could work during class hours. He even considered dropping out of school to work full-time, but he was so close to graduating. Just 1 more semester, and he would have his engineering degree. The worst part was that he had no one to turn to. His parents had made it clear that they thought college was a waste of money. "Get a real job," his father had said the last time they spoke. "Stop chasing impossible dreams." His older brother was struggling with his own family and couldn't help even if he wanted to. Jake had a few friends at school, but they were all broke college students just like him. That evening, Jake sat in the campus library trying to focus on his homework, but his mind kept wandering to his problems. He had less than a week to figure something out, or he would be sleeping in his car. The thought terrified him. How could he attend classes if he was homeless? How could he shower or do laundry? How could he complete his final semester and graduate? As the library prepared to close, Jake packed his books slowly, not wanting to return to his apartment and face reality. He decided to walk around campus for a while, hoping the fresh air would help him think clearly. The night was cool, and the campus was quiet except for the sound of his footsteps on the concrete walkways. He found himself at the student center, where a few vending machines glowed. In the darkness, Jake checked his pockets and found enough change to buy a candy bar. As he unwrapped it, he noticed someone had left a newspaper on one of the nearby tables. Normally, he wouldn't bother reading it, but tonight he had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. Jake flipped through the pages without much interest until he reached the classified section. Most of the ads were typical college town stuff, people selling textbooks, looking for roommates, or advertising tutoring services. But one ad caught his attention because it was so different from the others. Elderly woman seeks companionship and assistance. Generous compensation for the right person. Must be trustworthy and kind. Serious inquiries only. Jake read the ad 3 times. It didn't sound like a typical job posting, but maybe it was exactly what he needed. He had always been good with older people. His grandmother had lived with his family for several years before she passed away, and she always said he had a patient and caring nature. The ad included a phone number and an email address. Jake pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. What did generous compensation mean? Was this even a real job, or was it some kind of scam? But what choice did he have? In 6 days, he would be evicted, and then nothing else would matter. Jake decided to send an email. He kept it simple and honest, explaining that he was a college student who needed work and would be happy to help an elderly person with whatever they needed. He mentioned that he had experience caring for his grandmother and that he was reliable and hardworking. After reading the email several times, he finally hit send. The reply came faster than he expected. Within an hour, his phone buzzed with a new message. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, and she asked if he could meet her the next day at a coffee shop downtown. She seemed polite and professional in her email, which made Jake feel a little more confident about the whole situation. That night, Jake barely slept. He kept thinking about what kind of job this might be and whether it could solve his money problems. Maybe Mrs. Whitmore needed someone to help with grocery shopping or yard work. Maybe she needed a companion to talk with or someone to drive her to appointments. Whatever it was, Jake was willing to do it if it meant he could stay in school and finish his degree. The next morning, Jake put on his best clothes, a clean shirt and the only pair of pants he owned without holes in them. He caught the bus downtown and arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a small black coffee, and found a table where he could watch the door. At exactly 2 o'clock, an elderly woman walked into the coffee shop. She was well dressed in a way that suggested money. Her clothes looked expensive, and she carried herself with confidence. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and despite her age, she moved with purpose and energy. Jake had expected someone frail and needy, but this woman looked like she could take care of herself just fine. She looked around the coffee shop until her eyes met Jake's. He stood up and waved awkwardly, and she smiled and walked over to his table. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her 70s, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She extended her hand for a handshake, and her grip was surprisingly firm. "You must be Jake," she said in a clear, strong voice. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice." Jake felt nervous as he shook her hand and invited her to sit down. This woman seemed so sophisticated and put together. What could she possibly need from a broke college student like him? And more importantly, would whatever she needed pay enough to solve his problems? As Mrs. Whitmore settled into her chair and smiled at him expectantly, Jake realized his life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. He just had no idea how dramatically different things were about to become. Mrs. Whitmore ordered herself a cup of tea and settled back in her chair, studying Jake with those sharp eyes. He felt like she was reading his soul, seeing all his problems and struggles written on his face. The silence stretched between them, for what felt like forever before she finally spoke. "Tell me about yourself, Jake," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "What are you studying in college?" Jake cleared his throat nervously. "Engineering, ma'am. I'm in my final semester." "Well, I hope I am. I'm having some financial difficulties right now." He decided to be honest. What was the point of lying when she would probably figure out the truth anyway? Mrs. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "Financial troubles can be overwhelming at your age. I remember what it was like to struggle, though that was many years ago." She took a sip of her tea and continued watching him. "What kind of assistance were you thinking I might need?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, I'm not really sure. Your ad wasn't very specific. I thought maybe you needed help with shopping or cleaning or maybe someone to drive you places. I helped take care of my grandmother for several years, so I'm comfortable around older people." Something flickered across Mrs. Whitmore's face when he mentioned his grandmother, but it was gone so quickly Jake wasn't sure he had seen it at all. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more serious. "Jake, I'm going to be completely honest with you because I believe honesty is the foundation of any good relationship. What I need is not typical assistance that most people would expect." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Was this going to be some kind of weird situation? Had he walked into something dangerous or inappropriate? He started to stand up, ready to leave, but Mrs. Whitmore held up her hand. "Please sit down, let me explain before you make any decisions." Her voice was calm and reassuring, so Jake slowly sat back down. "I need a husband." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared at her in complete shock, his mouth hanging open. Had he heard her correctly? This elegant, wealthy-looking woman wanted to marry him? A broke college student who was about to be evicted? "I can see you're confused," Mrs. Whitmore continued, completely calm despite having just dropped the most shocking news of Jake's life. "Let me explain what I mean. I don't need a husband in the traditional sense. I need someone to enter into a legal marriage with me for business purposes." Jake found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Business purposes? Mrs. Whitmore nodded. There are certain legal and financial matters in my life that require me to have a spouse. I won't go into all the details right now because they're quite complicated, but I need someone trustworthy and intelligent to help me with this situation. Jake's head was spinning. This was not at all what he had expected when he answered that classified ad. He had thought he might end up doing yard work or grocery shopping, not entering into some kind of fake marriage with a stranger. I know this. Sounds unusual, Mrs. Whitmore said, seeming to read his thoughts. But I would make it worth your while. I would pay off all your student loans immediately. I would cover all your living expenses until you graduate. You would have a comfortable place to live in my home with your own private space. And after you graduate and find a job, we could discuss ending the arrangement if that's what you want. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what she was offering. No more student loan debt? No more worrying about rent or food? He could focus entirely on his studies for his final semester instead of working at the bookstore and still barely scraping by. What would be expected of me? He asked carefully. Very little, actually. We would need to appear in public together occasionally, so people believe we're a real married couple. We would attend a few social events, maybe have dinner together once or twice a week. But you would have your own bedroom, your own space, complete privacy. I'm not looking for romance or companionship in that sense. This would be strictly a business arrangement. Jake stared down at his coffee cup, trying to make sense of everything. It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it was too good to be true. But what if it wasn't? What if this strange woman was offering him a legitimate way out of his problems? Why me? He asked. You could probably find lots of people who would be interested in this kind of arrangement. Mrs. Whitmore smiled for the first time since they had started talking. You're right, I could, but I've been watching people, studying them. I need someone who is intelligent but not greedy. Someone who is honest but also discreet. Someone young enough that people won't be suspicious about why I married them, but mature enough to handle a complicated situation. Your email impressed me. You were straightforward and genuine, not trying to sell yourself or make promises you couldn't keep. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. She had been watching people. How long had she been planning this? And what exactly were these legal and financial matters she kept mentioning but wouldn't explain? I know you have questions, Mrs. Whitmore said. And I promise I will answer them all eventually. But first, I need to know if you're even interested in considering this proposal. If you are, we can meet again tomorrow and I can explain more details. If you're not, we can part ways now, and you can forget this conversation ever happened. Jake looked around the coffee shop, watching normal people living their normal lives. Students studying for exams, couples on dates, friends catching up over coffee. None of them were sitting across from an elderly woman who had just proposed a fake marriage to solve their financial problems. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to walk away. This whole situation was bizarre and probably dangerous. There had to be a catch, something she wasn't telling him. People didn't just offer to pay off student loans and provide free housing in exchange for occasionally appearing in public together. But the desperate part of his brain, the part that was terrified of being homeless in less than a week, was telling him to listen. What if this was the answer to all his problems? What if Mrs. Whitmore was exactly who she seemed to be? A wealthy woman who needed help with some legal situation and was willing to pay generously for it. Can I ask you something? Jake said finally. Of course. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is this arrangement going to put me in danger? Mrs. Whitmore considered his question carefully before answering. I won't lie to you, Jake. My situation is complicated, and there are some risks involved, but I don't believe you would be in any physical danger. The risks are more legal and financial in nature. That wasn't exactly reassuring, but at least she was being honest about there being risks. Jake appreciated that more than if she had tried to convince him everything was perfectly safe. I need to think about this, Jake said. Of course you do. It's a big decision. Mrs. Whitmore reached into her purse and pulled out an elegant business card. Here's my phone number. Take tonight to think it over. If you decide you're interested in hearing more, call me tomorrow morning and we'll meet again. If not, I'll understand completely. Jake took the card and looked at it. It was simple and expensive looking, with just her name and phone number printed in elegant letters. No address, no business name, nothing else. Mrs. Whitmore stood up and extended her hand again. Thank you for meeting with me today, Jake. Whatever you decide, I hope things work out well for you. As Jake watched her walk out of the coffee shop, he realized his hands were shaking. In the span of 1 hour, his entire life had been turned upside down. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to take the biggest risk of his life or go back to facing eviction and homelessness. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Jake spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of his tiny apartment, Mrs. Whitmore's business card sitting on his makeshift desk like it was made of fire. Every few minutes he would pick it up, read her name again, then put it back down. The eviction notice was still taped to his door, reminding him that he had less than 6 days to figure out his life. By morning, Jake had made his decision. He was terrified, but he was also out of options. He called Mrs. Whitmore at exactly 9 o'clock and told her he wanted to hear more details. She seemed pleased but not surprised, as if she had known all along what his answer would be. They met again that afternoon, this time at a small restaurant downtown. Mrs. Whitmore looked just as elegant as before, wearing a navy blue dress that probably cost more than Jake's entire wardrobe. She had papers with her this time, documents that she kept in a leather folder beside her plate. "I'm glad you decided to hear me out," she said as they ordered their food. "I think this arrangement could benefit both of us greatly." Over lunch, Mrs. Whitmore explained more about what she needed. She talked about legal requirements and financial complications, using words that Jake didn't fully understand but that sounded official and important. What he did understand was that she needed to be married for these legal matters to work properly, and she needed it to happen quickly. "How quickly?" Jake asked, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Ideally within the week." Jake nearly choked on his food. "This week? But I barely know you. I don't even know your middle name." Mrs. Whitmore smiled patiently. "My full name is Eleanor Catherine Whitmore. I'm 73 years old. I was married once before, but my husband passed away 15 years ago. I have no children. I live alone in a large house on Maple Street. What else would you like to know?" The casual way she listed these facts made Jake realize how little he really knew about what he was getting into. But then he thought about sleeping in his car and trying to finish college while homeless, and suddenly marrying a stranger didn't seem like the craziest option. "What happens after we're married?" he asked. "You'll move into my house immediately. I have a guest wing that will be entirely yours. Bedroom, bathroom, sitting area, everything you need. You can continue your studies without worrying about money. I'll handle all your expenses and pay off your student loans within the first month." It sounded like a dream, but Jake had learned that dreams usually came with hidden costs. "And what do I have to do in return?" "Attend a few social events with me. Have dinner together twice a week so my housekeeper doesn't get suspicious. Act like a normal married couple when we're in public, that's really all." Jake pushed his food around his plate, thinking, why can't you just hire an actor or something? Why does it have to be a real marriage? Mrs. Whitmore's expression became more serious. "Because the legal matters I'm dealing with require a legitimate marriage certificate. Everything has to be completely legal and official, or it won't work." That afternoon, they went to the courthouse together. Jake felt like he was watching someone else's life as he filled out the marriage license application. His hands shook as he signed his name next to hers on the official papers. Mrs. Whitmore seemed completely calm, as if she got married to college students every day. The ceremony itself was over in less than 10 minutes. The justice of the peace read from a small book while Jake and Mrs. Whitmore stood side by side in a sterile government office. There were 2 witnesses, Mrs. Whitmore's lawyer, a thin man who looked nervous, and her accountant, a woman who kept checking her watch. When the justice of the peace said, "You may kiss the bride," Jake panicked for a moment. But Mrs. Whitmore simply shook his hand and said, "Thank you, Jake," in the same tone she might use to thank someone for holding a door open. And just like that, Jake went from being a broke college student about to be evicted to being the husband of one of the wealthiest women in town. It felt completely unreal, like he was playing a part in some strange movie. Mrs. Whitmore, he supposed he should think of her as his wife now, though that seemed impossible. drove him to her house that evening. Jake had seen the neighborhood before but never imagined he would live there. The houses were enormous, with perfect lawns and gates that probably cost more than his parents' entire house. Mrs. Whitmore's house was the biggest on the street. It was a beautiful old Victorian mansion with 3 stories and more windows than Jake could count. The driveway was long and curved, lined with trees that looked like they had been growing there for decades. "Welcome home," Mrs. Whitmore said, as they pulled up to the front door. Jake grabbed his 2 duffel bags from the back seat. Everything he owned in the world fit into 2 bags, and followed her up the front steps. The front door was huge and made of dark wood with glass panels that looked like they came from a church. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The ceilings were high and decorated with intricate molding. A grand staircase curved up to the 2nd floor, and Jake could see expensive furniture and artwork everywhere he looked. It was like stepping into a museum. "Let me show you to your rooms," Mrs. Whitmore said, leading him up the staircase. The guest wing was on the 2nd floor, separated from the main part of the house by a hallway. Jake's new bedroom was bigger than his entire old apartment. It had a king-size bed with a thick comforter, a desk that looked like it was made from real wood, and a sitting area with 2 chairs and a coffee table. "Your bathroom is through that door," Mrs. Whitmore said, pointing to a door Jake hadn't even noticed. "And this sitting room connects to a small kitchen area where you can prepare your own meals if you prefer privacy." Jake walked around the rooms in amazement. Everything was clean and expensive and beautiful. The bathroom had a bathtub big enough for 2 people and towels that felt softer than any clothes he owned. "I know this is all very overwhelming," Mrs. Whitmore said kindly. "Take tonight to settle in. Tomorrow we can discuss the practical details of our arrangement." After she left, Jake sat on the enormous bed and tried to process what had happened. That morning, he had been a desperate college student with $47 to his name. Now he was married and living in a mansion that looked like something from a fairy tale. But as the evening wore on, Jake started noticing things that made him uncomfortable. The house was too quiet, as if the walls were thick enough to block out all sound from the outside world. Mrs. Whitmore's part of the house seemed far away, and he realized he had no idea what she did with her time when she wasn't with him. Around midnight, Jake heard a car in the driveway. He looked out his window and saw a black sedan pull up to the front door. 2 men in dark suits got out and went into the house. Jake waited by his window, but they didn't come back out. After an hour, he finally went to bed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his new wife had secrets that went far deeper than complicated legal matters. As he lay in the comfortable bed, Jake wondered what he had really gotten himself into. The house might be beautiful and his problems might be solved, but something told him that his real troubles were just beginning. Jake woke up the next morning in the most comfortable bed he had ever slept in, but he felt more confused than rested. The events of the previous day seemed like a dream, except everything around him proved it was real. The expensive furniture, the thick carpets, the bathroom with towels that probably cost more than his old monthly rent. It was all there. He got dressed and made his way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and bacon. The kitchen was enormous, with granite countertops and appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant. Mrs. Whitmore was sitting at a breakfast table by a large window, reading a newspaper while a woman Jake hadn't met before cooked at the stove. "Good morning, Jake," Mrs. Whitmore said without looking up from her paper. "I hope you slept well. This is Rosa, my housekeeper. She'll be preparing most of our meals." Rosa turned and smiled at Jake. She was a middle-aged woman, with kind eyes and flour on her apron. "Good morning, Mr. Jake. What would you like for breakfast?" The title Mr. Jake felt strange, but he didn't want to correct her. "Just some toast would be fine, thank you." "Nonsense," Mrs. Whitmore said, finally looking up from her newspaper. "Rosa makes the best pancakes in the city. You should try them." Jake found himself sitting down to a breakfast that was bigger than most dinners he used to eat. Pancakes, bacon, eggs, fresh fruit, and orange juice that actually tasted like oranges instead of sugar water. Rosa kept bringing him more food even though he insisted he was full. "Rosa has been with me for 8 years," Mrs. Whitmore explained. She lives in the small apartment above the garage, so she's here most days. She's very discreet and minds her own business. Something about the way she said discreet made Jake pay attention. It sounded like a warning, though he wasn't sure what he was being warned about. After breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore showed him around more of the house. There were rooms Jake couldn't believe anyone actually needed. A library with books from floor to ceiling, a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12 people, a living room that looked like it had never been lived in. Everything was perfect and expensive and somehow cold, despite all the beautiful furniture. "The third floor is mostly storage and my private office," Mrs. Whitmore said as they walked past a staircase Jake hadn't noticed before. "I do most of my business work up there, so I'd prefer if you didn't go up there without asking." Jake nodded, though he wondered what kind of business work required an entire floor. Mrs. Whitmore had never actually told him what she did for a living, just that she had legal and financial matters to handle. That afternoon, Jake tried to focus on his college assignments, but he kept getting distracted by sounds in the house, footsteps on the stairs when he thought Mrs. Whitmore was in the garden, doors closing when he was sure everyone was downstairs, phone conversations in what sounded like different languages, always stopping abruptly when he got close enough to hear clearly. On his third day in the house, Jake was studying in the library when he heard Mrs. Whitmore talking to someone in the next room. Her voice sounded different, sharper and more commanding than the gentle tone she used with him. "The documents need to be ready by Friday," she was saying. "I don't care what it costs or how many people you have to call. This timeline cannot change." Jake couldn't hear the other person's response, but Mrs. Whitmore's reply made his blood run cold. "If there are any problems, any complications at all, you know what will happen. I didn't spend 15 years building this network to have it fall apart now." "Network? What kind of network?" Jake quietly closed his textbook and tried to leave the library without making noise, but the old wooden floor creaked under his feet. The conversation in the next room stopped immediately. "Jake? Is that you?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice was back to its normal, sweet tone. "Yes, ma'am. I was just going upstairs to study." "Of course, dear. Don't let me disturb you." But Jake was disturbed, very disturbed. He went back to his room and tried to concentrate on his homework, but his mind kept racing. What kind of network was Mrs. Whitmore talking about? And what did she mean by, "you know what will happen," if there were problems? That night, Jake heard cars in the driveway again. He looked out his window and saw the same black sedan from his first night, plus a white van he hadn't seen before. This time he watched more carefully. 4 people got out of the vehicles, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark, professional-looking clothes. They carried briefcases and what looked like computer equipment. Jake waited by his window for hours, but the vehicles didn't leave until almost sunrise. Whatever meeting was happening in Mrs. Whitmore's house, it was serious business that required all-night sessions. The next morning, Mrs. Whitmore seemed tired but tried to act normal during breakfast. She asked Jake about his classes and listened politely as he talked about his engineering projects. But Jake noticed that her hands shook slightly when she lifted her coffee cup, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Are you feeling all right?" Jake asked, genuinely concerned despite his growing suspicions. "Just a little tired, dear. I had some business calls that ran late last night. Business calls that required 4 people with briefcases and computer equipment to show up at her house." Jake didn't think so, but he didn't say anything. Over the next few days, Jake started paying closer attention to everything around him. He noticed that mail came for Mrs. Whitmore addressed to at least 3 different names. He saw her receive packages that she immediately took upstairs to her private office, never letting Rosa or anyone else handle them. Most concerning of all, he realized that Mrs. Whitmore seemed to know things about him that he had never told her. "How was your chemistry exam?" she asked one morning over breakfast. Jake nearly dropped his fork. "How did you know I had a chemistry exam?" "Didn't you mention it yesterday?" "No, I didn't. I haven't talked to anyone about my exam schedule." Mrs. Whitmore's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "I must have overheard you talking to someone on the phone." But Jake knew he hadn't talked to anyone on the phone about his exams. He barely had any friends, and the few people he did talk to weren't interested in his class schedule. So how did Mrs. Whitmore know? That evening, Jake decided to do some investigating of his own. He waited until Mrs. Whitmore went upstairs to her office, then quietly explored parts of the house he hadn't seen before. Most of the rooms were locked, but he found one door that opened when he turned the handle. Inside was what looked like a small office, but not the kind of office most people would have in their homes. There were multiple computer monitors, filing cabinets that looked heavy-duty and secure, and walls covered with maps, photographs, and documents written in languages Jake didn't recognize. On one of the desks, Jake saw a folder with his name on it. His heart pounded as he opened it and found copies of documents he had never given to Mrs. Whitmore. His college transcripts, his employment records, even a copy of his lease agreement for his old apartment. There were photographs of him taken, from a distance walking to class and working at the bookstore. At the bottom of the folder was a background check report that was more detailed than anything Jake had ever seen. It included information about his family, his financial situation, even his grandmother's medical records from when she had lived with his family years ago. Jake's hands were shaking as he closed the folder and backed away from the desk. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't chosen him randomly from a classified ad. She had been watching him, studying him, investigating every detail of his life before she ever contacted him. As footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, Jake realized he was in more danger than he had ever imagined. Whatever Mrs. Whitmore was really involved in, he was now part of it whether he wanted to be or not, and getting out might be much harder than getting in had been. Jake barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made him jump, and he kept replaying what he had seen in that hidden office. The folder with his name, the photographs taken without his knowledge, the background check that knew more about his life than he remembered himself. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't just answered his desperate email. She had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The next morning, Jake sat at the breakfast table trying to act normal while his mind raced with questions. Mrs. Whitmore chatted pleasantly about the weather and asked about his plans for the day, but Jake could barely focus on her words. All he could think about was that folder and what it meant. "You seem distracted today, dear," Mrs. Whitmore said, setting down her coffee cup. "Is everything all right?" Jake looked up at her, this elegant woman who had seemed like his savior just a week ago. Now he wondered who she really was and what she really wanted from him. "I'm fine, just tired." But Mrs. Whitmore was studying his face with those sharp eyes, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his lie. She had probably been reading people and spotting lies for much longer than he had been alive. That afternoon, Jake tried to leave the house to go to class, but found that his car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but immediately died no matter what he tried. When he went back inside to ask Mrs. Whitmore if he could borrow her car, she seemed surprisingly unsurprised by his problem. "Oh, that old car of yours has been giving you trouble for months," she said sympathetically. "Why don't you just stay home today? You can study here just as well." But Jake remembered that his car had been running perfectly fine just 2 days ago. The timing of it breaking down, right when he was starting to ask questions, seemed too convenient to be an accident. As the day wore on, Jake noticed other things that made him uncomfortable. Rosa seemed to be watching him more carefully than usual, always finding reasons to clean rooms near wherever he was studying. The phone rang constantly, but Mrs. Whitmore always answered it quickly and spoke in hushed tones. And Jake could swear he saw someone watching the house from a car parked across the street. That evening, Jake made a decision. He had to confront Mrs. Whitmore and find out what was really going on. He couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. After dinner, he knocked on the door of her private sitting room. "Come in, Jake," she called before he even announced himself. Mrs. Whitmore was sitting in an elegant chair by the fireplace, but she wasn't reading or watching television. She was just sitting there, as if she had been waiting for him. On the coffee table beside her was the folder with his name on it. "I wondered when you would find that," she said calmly, nodding toward the folder. "You're more curious than I expected, but not as careful as you should be." Jake's heart pounded as he realized she knew he had been snooping around the house. I want to know what's going on. I want to know who you really are and why you have all that information about me. Mrs. Whitmore gestured to the chair across from her. Sit down, Jake. It's time we had an honest conversation. Jake remained standing, ready to run if he needed. Start talking. Mrs. Whitmore sighed and looked older than he had ever seen her. My real name is Eleanor Whitmore and I'm 73 years old, but almost everything else you think you know about me is a lie. She reached for a glass of wine Jake hadn't noticed before and took a slow sip. I spent most of my adult life working for the government in ways that most people never know exist. I traveled the world, lived under different names, gathered information that helped keep this country safe. I was very good at my job, Jake. Too good, perhaps. Jake felt his legs go weak and sank into the chair despite his intention to stay standing. You're a spy? I was a spy. I retired 15 years ago after my husband was killed because of my work. I thought I was done with that life forever, but some things from the past have a way of catching up with you. Mrs. Whitmore set down her wine glass and looked directly at Jake. 3 months ago, I discovered that certain people I worked against years ago have found out where I live and who I really am. They want information I have, and they want revenge for operations I was involved in that cost them a lot of money and several of their people. So why did you marry me? Jake asked, though he was starting to have a terrible feeling he knew the answer. Because I needed someone young and innocent looking to help me with one final mission. I needed someone smart enough to understand complicated instructions but not experienced enough to ask the right questions too soon. Most importantly, I needed someone who had no choice but to trust me. Jake felt sick to his stomach. You used me. Yes, I did. But Jake, you have to understand. I didn't have any other options. These people who are after me, they're not just going to kill me and walk away. They're going to torture me first to get the information they want. And that information could hurt a lot of innocent people if it falls into the wrong hands. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward in her chair, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked truly vulnerable. I know this is overwhelming and I know you're scared, but I need your help to stop these people once and for all. The work we've been doing these past few nights, the meetings you've seen, we've been preparing to take down a network of criminals that has been operating for decades. We? Jake asked. The people you've seen coming to the house are former colleagues of mine, good people who believe in protecting innocent lives. We've been tracking this criminal network for months, gathering evidence, building a case that will put them away forever. Jake's mind was spinning. What does this have to do with me? I don't know anything about spies or criminals or government work. Mrs. Whitmore smiled sadly. You know more than you think. You're an engineering student, Jake. You understand systems and how they work. We need someone with your skills to help us access a computer system that contains all the evidence we need. She reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small device that looked like a flash drive. This contains a program that will download everything we need from their servers, but it has to be installed from the inside by someone they would never suspect. You want me to break into their computer system? I want you to help us stop people who hurt innocent families for money, people who traffic children and sell weapons to terrorists, people who would kill both of us without hesitation if they knew what we were planning. Jake stared at the device in Mrs. Whitmore's hand, feeling like the whole world had shifted beneath his feet. A week ago, his biggest problem had been paying rent. Now he was married to a former spy who wanted him to help take down international criminals. What happens if I say no? He asked quietly. Mrs. Whitmore's expression became very serious. Then, we'll both probably be dead within a month. These people don't leave loose ends, Jake. The moment I married you, you became part of this whether you wanted to be or not. Outside, Jake heard the sound of sirens in the distance getting closer. Mrs. Whitmore heard them too and stood up quickly. They've found us, she said, her voice sharp with urgency. Jake, I need you to decide right now. Are you going to help me finish this, or are we both going to spend the rest of our very short lives running? As the sirens grew louder and doors slammed in the driveway, Jake realized that his quiet life as a struggling college student was over forever. Whatever he decided in the next few moments would determine not just his future, but whether he and Mrs. Whitmore would live to see another day. The front door burst open downstairs and Jake heard heavy footsteps rushing through the house. Time was up.